In this lecture, we want to talk about engaging counterarguments and objections. This is both to your claim as well as, and more appropriately, to the argument that you make throughout your paper. This is one of those elements of a good research paper that goes to your ethos, that you engage correctly these counterarguments and objections. Okay, what kind of objections or counterarguments might a reader make? And remember, the advantage of engaging these things are exactly the same advantages as limiting your claim. That is, it enhances your ethos, it demonstrates your character and your objectivity and your intelligence, and it also establishes your authority and helps you limit the objections. So the things I'm talking with you about now will help you keep control of the conversation. So if you know what types of objections there are, then you might be better prepared to deal with them. There are intrinsic potential objections. That is, a question about the internal soundness of your argument, questions about your claim, questions about your reasons, questions about your evidence. This is how I will tend to judge your work. The intrinsic contrariness, the intrinsic issues with your paper. And don't get carried away with that. I mean, that's just what I'm looking at, and attempting to get you to be a better author. Now, I and other readers will also ask you about the extrinsic values of your paper, or we might raise extrinsic objections, and those are what others say and how you fit into that conversation. Do you fit yourself correctly into the conversation? Have you legitimately summarized what that conversation is? Another extrinsic potential objection is the way that you have framed your claim and interpretations. Have you done it correctly? Are you talking about the right thing? And alternative explanations, particularly multiple causality. You may say X is caused by Y. Intrinsically, I will have a problem with that because it's passive voice. But someone may say, but also Z and other things caused X. So these are the types of objections. How do you anticipate these objections? Well, and which ones do you respond to? Because that's what you have to do to objections. When you see that they're coming at you, you have to respond. You have to get ahead of it. So can you anticipate intrinsic objections? Yes. Can you anticipate extrinsic objections? And the answer is also yes. But of these objections, particularly the extrinsic objections, how do you know which ones to respond to? Well, respond to those that are plausible and reasonable and potentially commonly shared. Also, if you see any holes in your own paper, any gaps in your research, any problem areas that you can't fix, then those are places that other people will see also. And so you need to be prepared to explain what you've done, to anticipate objections about gaps in your knowledge. But only respond to the things that are reasonable and plausible. You don't need to make a tinfoil helmet here, okay? You don't have to respond to the crazy stuff or anything that you can possibly think of. Only the plausible potential objections. How do you anticipate? Pretend that you are a reader who opposes your claim. You want you to be wrong. Alternatively, you can imagine alternatives. That is, think about how you might pose alternative explanations that are plausible and reasonable to what you have written. This means that you can't be writing the paper the night before it's due. You need to be ahead of the game a little bit here so you can let the paper sit long enough to get some distance from it. Because when you're too close to it, you'll know what you're talking about, but it won't make any sense to your readers. Well, what are some predictable disagreements? Now, these were identified by Booth, Collum, and Williams in the coda to their chapter for this week's reading. There are three types of extrinsic objections that someone else might make to your work, and so you have to predict that these are coming at you. Other causes exist. That's a predictable disagreement. How are you going to answer that? Other evidence exists. That's a predictable disagreement. How do you respond? And what they don't use this word, the equivocation fallacy. That is, you define terms one way and your reader defines those terms a different way. How many times have you listened to a disagreement, and I see this on political blogs that I read, in which commenters talk past one another because they refuse to agree on the definition of the words that they're using, what X actually means. And so in reality, their ridiculous conversations have to do with just defining the words. You may run into that too. And when one arguer defines words a particular way and either changes those definitions or another person argues about the definition of a word, then you've run into the equivocation fallacy. How are you going to respond? Well, obviously the best way is to plug the hole. How specifically should you respond? What are the techniques for response? You should acknowledge these objections that are plausible, reasonable, and that you can see. You need to take these, the real ones, seriously. Treat them with respect. These people aren't out to get you. They're asking you legitimate questions about your conclusions, about how you reached your conclusions. Treat that with some respect. In your paper, anticipate, respond respectfully. Again, you actually have to respond in your text. Here's a good place to use various templates, particularly those that are offered by Booth and Collum and Williams, and then a couple that you can modify from Graf and Birkenstein. You can downplay the significance of the objection. You're bringing it up as if you're somebody else. You can say, but this objection isn't really all that valid because of this and this and this. You can hedge. It seems to be this way, but it's really not. And you can use Graf and Birkenstein's agree, disagree, or agree while disagreeing, not only as far as your claim goes, but also when you are responding to objections. They're templates for agreeing, disagreeing, and doing both simultaneously. Apply at all levels. Acknowledge those questions that you cannot answer. If you see a big gap in what you've written and you just can't figure it out, acknowledge it and discuss it. You don't have to apologize for it. That's bad form. But acknowledge it and discuss it. Also, you can respond, as Booth and Collum and Williams in Craft of Research say, you can make your response as a subordinate argument. That is, give reasons and evidence for why you don't agree with this person's counter-argument. Go ahead and address it. That's a good way of dealing with all of your problems. Finally, one mechanism for bringing the problems out, particularly the big ones, and dealing with them in your own way so you retain control of your narrative and it doesn't get picked to death by your readers, me, is to use those templates in both Booth et al. And Graff and Birkenstein that deal with planting a naysayer. Now, Graff and Birkenstein are more obvious about this than Booth, Cullum, and Williams are. But if you think about introducing a person who will personify the objection, who will bring the objection forward, then this is called planting a naysayer. It's a way of responding in a mechanism that's a conversation, rather than you just simply piling on more data and more interpretation as if the objection is stupid and can simply be overwhelmed with more evidence. You have to converse with the objection. How do you converse with an objection? You can't. You converse with a person. So introduce a person and pretend you're actually talking to a person or you're writing to that particular person. The point here is for you to anticipate objection, then introduce those that your readers will know that you understand, and then answer those objections. Planting a naysayer allows you to introduce objections that you anticipated and understand, and then it gives you a mechanism for answering directly to the type of reader that you might have. There's some templates. You might use things like skeptics might think. You might use things like this line of reasoning might seem weak, but, and you can often give a specific label to the naysayer if that label is true. You don't want to be too specific, however. I certainly don't want to see your paper say something like, historical methods professors might object. That's way too specific. They say other historians might think this, blah, blah, blah. And that would be a satisfactory planting of a naysayer. Okay, time to summarize. There are intrinsic and extrinsic objections. You have to anticipate those that are reasonable, plausible, commonly shared, or those that point out holes in your own research and writing. There are three kinds of predictable disagreements. Those that other causes exist to what you say, other evidence exists, and words are defined differently. When you respond, which you must do, acknowledge the objections, treat them seriously, respond in your text, acknowledge any of the questions that you can't answer, and you can create subordinate arguments in order to respond to real objections. Finally, you might use the mechanism of planting a naysayer. This allows you to personalize your response by not making it personal, but by dealing with another person in a conversation, even if imaginary, than dealing with some kind of abstract concept. With that, we're finished talking about this material. I know this has been a little bit long, but thank you, as always, for your attention.